thunder split the stillness of the chilly spring night as the roar of 2,000 engines echoed across the countryside. All across England, black forms rose from countless bases to array themselves in ever-growing formations in the night sky. These were the lead transport planes of an armada so vast it soon stretched through the darkness from horizon to horizon. The planes swept across the Channel toward the dark coast of France. The die was cast. There would be no turning back. Within the cramped confines of these aircraft huddled the better part of 3 Allied airborne divisions. They would soon be parachuting into Normandy, where their mission was to protect the flanks of the invasion area and to seize the ground behind the beach exits. Part of the armada headed for the invasion's left. Got a glimpse of the vast invasion fleet in the water below.
Going across that channel was the biggest sight I ever saw in my life. It was a solid mass of ships from one side to the other. I never did hear how many ships they thought was in it, but it was a pile of them.
Below the great procession of aircraft, cold and seasick men aboard the ships turned their eyes skyward and watched in awe as wave after wave of C-47s lumbered overhead.
That night we listened to the drone of the airplanes, flew right over our head, and we could see them going, and their lights, and so forth, and then the gliders, and of course they were quiet, but they were being towed, and we knew the invasion was on.
Leaving the Allied fleet in its wake below, the initial wave of C-47s reached the French coast. These first transports carried the Pathfinders, the first men to jump into Normandy that night. Operation Overlord had begun.
Pathfinders are the specialized troops that went in first and basically marked a drop zone. Especially important in a night drop when you need something to navigate on in order to get the troops to all drop in the same place. The problem is, of course, you've got to get the Pathfinders to the right place in the first place. Some of them managed it. An awful lot of them got scattered. And the amazing thing is that when they landed and realized they were in the wrong place, most of them simply went about trying to find the right place instead of setting up a false drop zone and ending up with a whole company behind them coming into the wrong place.
At almost the same time the Pathfinders were floating to the ground, 6 gliders filled with British assault troops and engineers slipped through the night into Normandy. Theirs was a mission of crucial importance: capture the bridges across the Orne River and Caen Canal a few miles inland from Sword Beach. The Caen Canal Bridge, better known as Pegasus Bridge, was a vital objective. In British hands, it could be used to expand the beachhead to the east of the Orne River. In German hands, it could be used to strike at Sword Beach's vulnerable flank. Silently, the gliders soared over Pegasus Bridge, then circled around to land right alongside the Caen Canal.
And these gliders, British, called it Horsa, and it ended up more than 100 feet from that bridge. And how they got down, and this was at night, and captured the bridge, which was really a miracle that they even survived the landing.
The Germans had wired it with explosives to blow it in the event that there was an attack. However, as a safety precaution, they had detached the wiring. And so the Ochsenbucks were capable of capturing the bridge intact before the Germans had the opportunity to rewire the explosives and blow the bridge. They then proceeded to occupy and hold it, in addition to a bridge just about a mile to the east crossing over the Orne River. So that in the early morning hours of the invasion, the British 6th Airborne was able to capture and hold the two bridges that would have made it possible for the Germans to send reinforcements directly into the flank of the Sword Beach invasion area.
At the same time the British troops stormed Pegasus Bridge, British bombers pounded nearby targets to cover the assault. This attack was just a foretaste of things to come. Thousands of Allied planes would soon be in the air, softening up the beaches in the final hours before the troops went in. In keeping with the deception plan, even at this late moment, RAF crews also flew hundreds of sorties against the Pas-de-Calais area. While the bombers made their runs, the German anti-aircraft gunners unleashed a barrage of fire into the night sky. Into this inferno flew the transport planes carrying the 101st and 82nd Airborne.
We could see off in the distance the tracers coming up, and it looked like a solid wall of fire going up. The stream of C-47 started to go over either the 82nd or the 101st, and we looked up at the planes going over, and you look at the planes and then you look over in the distance to see what they were flying into.
We headed west so we could make a big loop around the invasion fleet that was going in, because they had the experience in Sicily of shooting down a bunch of 82nd Airborne planes that by the Navy, mistaking them. And I didn't want that happening here, so they flew around there, and we came across the west side of the Cherbourg Peninsula, and it was an easy flight going in.
The peaceful flight over the Channel was about to be abruptly interrupted as their course took them over the German-occupied Channel Islands and through thick fog along the coast of France.
The aircraft fire opened up on us between the islands of Jersey and Guernsey. That was kind of frightening, but it was something that we couldn't do anything about and couldn't control. It was kind of frightening to sit up there on that damn plane and think you may get shot down here. Well, that was, nobody wanted that. Got out of that aircraft fire and got into the coast and hit a fog bank. And the planes were, and you're sitting there, well, am I going to bump into somebody else? And you got all these airplanes, and I guess they're going in different directions. You don't know. We finally come out of the fog bank, and then the aircraft started again.
Instantly, formations fell apart as the pilots desperately sought to avoid mid-air collisions and the renewed German anti-aircraft fire.
When we hit the mainland, a 50 caliber machine gun got on us, riddled bucket seats up and down one side of the whole plane. The pilot hollered back and wondered how many guys were hit. We checked off up and down the line and nobody. He wouldn't believe us. He sent the co-pilot back. He went back, nope, nobody's hit.
And you could look out those plane windows and see the tracers from the machine gun fire coming up at us. Coming right at us. But time those shells got to where the plane was, they were slowed down. They were pretty well spent. And so when they hit that air driven back by the propellers, they would curve. And we started getting those tracer bullets going right through the tail end of the plane, right where Buck West was standing. He moved to the front of the door.
Inside the C-47s, the heavily loaded paratroops struggled to keep their feet as the planes scattered all over the night sky. With the American air landings now in total chaos, RAF bombers swept in from the English Channel to drop thousands of dummy paratroopers, called Ruperts, to confuse the Germans. Chaos reigned in every German command post in France. The Germans had no idea what was going on, and those who did have something to report couldn't do it because phone lines all over the country had been cut by French resistance fighters. It was a mess, and the German High Command was paralyzed for hours as a result. All over Normandy, the night was scarred by searchlights, tracers, flak, and flaming planes.
We heard explosions, and we knew we were being fired on. I was rather interested in getting the hell out of there, personally.
Most of the C-47 pilots had never been under fire. They did their best to get the paratroopers to their assigned drop zones, but fog, high wind, and enemy fire had caused so many problems that most had no idea where their drop zones were.
At one time, our plane got caught in anti-aircraft fire, and the plane dove for the treetops. I think that must have been just about where the point where we were going to jump. The plane dove for the treetops and flew as fast as possible to get out of there. And before we knew it, we were over the water on the other side again. I was wondering what's going on there. We going back to England or what? Then the plane turned around, flew over the coast again, inland from the other side, flew a few minutes, and gave us the green light, and we jumped.
Instead of coming in at 500 or 600 feet, why, the pilots dropped way down and took evasive action, which is a natural thing to do. And they gave us a green light. I don't even think we had a red light, just gave us a green light, and out we went.
We went clear across the peninsula, and we got strict orders not to go back with the plane. And we told him to fly back in 3 minutes, and we'd go. Well, we knew right away here's going to be another deal like Sicily. We ended up about 11, 12 miles from where we were supposed to be, which our designated point was St. Mary Glees.
The orderly drop envisioned by the D-Day planners never happened. Instead, the C-47s dropped their men all over the countryside.
I landed in an elm tree. The canopy of my chute drifted over an elm tree, and when I came down, my back hit the back of the hedgerow, which is always, it was a lot of brush. It's like backing into a cushion. My feet were touching the ground.
When we jumped in Normandy, I hung in a tree, and I thought I saw a man. Pretty soon I heard a click. And he had I knew what he had. He had one of those smirk guns. They were, you know, you could shoot multiple shells. And when he done that, boy, I reached down and got my knife and I cut myself down and I rolled out. He did. Then he left. He thought he got me.
Some of the paratroopers landed 20 miles from their objectives. Some fell into the sea, while others landed in the flooded fields around the Merdere River. Laden with gear and unable to get out of their chutes, many of these men drowned.
We were just getting ready to get on those planes, and somebody came and fastened that leg pack. I don't know what was in it. I couldn't get up into the plane by myself. They had to help me up in there. So I landed with that thing over my head in water. And I couldn't get it off. So here I am like some kind of a fish jumping up to get a breath of air and then go back down. And I'm a non-swimmer. So this was something of a problem. I did get it loose, and then I discovered that I'm in 7 feet of water here, and it's 18 inches deep here, and it's 18 inches deep here. I'm standing in a ditch. This is the area that the Germans had flooded.
The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were hopelessly scattered, many jumpers unable to even find the other members of their own platoon before daybreak. In unfamiliar terrain, broken up by hedgerows and cut by swampy streams, they struggled to orient themselves.
After we landed and we were so damn dispersed and away from where we belonged, I don't know where, I couldn't go to the map and tell you where I landed. All I can tell you is that I wasn't anywhere near 101st people. I don't even know where the people out of my plane landed in relation to me.
You don't know what's going on, you don't know where you are, you don't know where your friends are or who your friends are, and it's your first time that you've ever been in that kind of a situation, and so you're scared to death.
I rolled over on my back to start taking my parachute off, and here goes a string of tracers right over my head. They were probably 5 feet up, and then I hear something, and here comes some guy over, and they had issued us these little crickets as a sign and countersign. So if you cricked a cricket, that one crick meant it was the sign, and 2 cricks was the countersign. So I saw that somebody coming, I cricked, and I had to click, click. And I told the guy, you better get down. So he got down and he crawled away, and just about time he's crawling past me, that machine gunner opened up again. He says, thanks, pal, and off he went.
The first person I met turned out to be a member of the 101st Airborne. He had a cricket, you know, the metal thing that goes click, click. He was going, I was hearing this click, click all over the place, wondering what it was. And it turned out that this guy, so we had a password, so I give him a password he's supposed to answer to me, and he answered by click, click. And I didn't know anything about this click, click. It turned out to be a disaster there. Anyway, nobody was trigger happy, so he went on his way. He was disgusted. He wasn't the one I was looking for. He went away, click, click, click. And I went my own way trying to find the rest of the man I jumped with, and I eventually found them.
The exception to the confusion was the 505th Parachute Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division, most of which landed virtually intact close to the town of Saint-Mère-Église.
I landed in a pasture outside of Saint-Mère-Église, the little town of Saint-Mère-Église, and then I heard these footsteps coming toward me. So I quickly rolled over and got my rifle out, and I was just bringing it up to aim, and this big cow stuck its head right at me and mooed right in my face. I was glad it was a cow. 505 and my plane, we landed right where we were supposed to be. And so by morning we were very well organized and very well situated. That too added to the confusion of who was where and what their actual mission was. But the Germans took a long time to recover and figure out where the attack was really coming from.
Nothing went according to plan, but I think the result was just as good. The men were spread out all over the place, but it was just as well. There was really mass confusion from the Germans because since we were all over the place, they didn't know how many we were. Every time they turned around, they'd run into us.
Again, it comes back to the fact that by accident, the scattering had a certain effect of making it hard to tell what's going on. It's also the fact that we had been very careful to try and make the Germans believe that this was not a major invasion. That the major invasion was going to Pas-de-Calais, Patton and his entire army group was right across the coast, and this was going to be at most a feint or something to draw their attention. And this had more effect at the strategic level, but I suspect, especially from commanders that had been to map exercises and staff conferences with the higher commanders, say, okay, yes, Normandy, this is just designed to get our reserves looking this way, so we'll be very careful how we react to it. And a little delay was fatal.
Despite all the preparation, training, and planning the Allies devoted to the airborne phase of D-Day, the actual drops had gone hopelessly awry. Now, in the early hours of June 6th, small groups of paratroopers gathered together to try to salvage the situation. For the 82nd, that meant taking Saint-Mère-Église as soon as possible. The 505th Regiment rallied in the darkness, formed up, and marched off for the town and its nearby bridges over the Merdere River.
I made my way into Saint-Mère-Église, and everything was quiet there. I guess I was one of the first guys in there, except we had what we called pathfinders, and they went several hours ahead of our regular jump to okay the landing site for us as we came in. They had their little bleeper radios. But as I walked down the main street of one of the main streets of Saint-Mère-Église, which is a little village, there was a row of trees along the side, and practically every tree had a paratroop pathfinder hanging in it by his parachute. And they were all riddled with machine gun bullets and blood dripping on the sidewalk.
Well, our mission was really centered around Saint-Mère-Église. At that time, there were not a lot of roads. Saint-Mère-Église was a major road intersection. Roads from the north, from Cherbourg, from the west, and from the south would be a major road hub for anybody counterattacking Utah Beach. So our role was to block all of the accesses to Utah Beach to give the beach landing forces protection till they could come up and join us.
As the 505th captured Saint-Mère-Église, 50 miles to the east, British paratroopers assaulted Ronville, where they ran into elements of the 21st Panzer Division. Nevertheless, the British captured the town and took several key bridges across the Dives River. At 3:30 that morning, the British 5th Parachute Brigade arrived over Normandy in 68 gliders. Their nocturnal landing, while hair-raising in some cases, brought in the division's anti-tank guns, vehicles, and the 6th Airborne Headquarters Group. Meanwhile, the British 9th Parachute Battalion's carefully planned and coordinated attack on the Merville battery that dominated Sword Beach fell apart in the confusion of the drop.
Their plan was to land an assault force by parachute in the immediate vicinity of the battery at Merville. They would then wait for a glider force that would fly in and land within the confines of the battery perimeter. They could then blow openings in the barbed wire, clear a path through the landmines, allowing the parachute assault force to move in and join them for the final assault on the casemates themselves. And then after successfully capturing the battery, they would fire a signal using a flare gun to signal the fleet that Merville had been captured and had been neutralized. Without seeing that flare, the fleet had been given instructions to open fire on the battery just before daylight.
With time running short and most of the troops nowhere to be found, the British paratroopers stormed the battery in a bloody assault. Just 15 minutes before the Royal Navy was due to shell the area, the signal went out that the 6th Airborne had accomplished its last task. To the west of the British zone, the dispersed Americans began attacking the Germans all over the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. The scattered paratroops joined up with anyone they could find, teaming up with guys from different units and even different divisions.
Well, I teamed up or tied up with a whole group of men from the 82nd Division. The officer that I connected up with was an 82nd Division person, and I don't have any idea who they were, what part of the 82nd. They had an 82nd patch, that's all I can tell you. But he sent me out to scout and this and that, just like anybody else, you know.
Two of the other guys in the platoon landed in the same field that I did. There were just the three of us. I'd seen an orchard across the road that had, you could see paratroopers of some kind. We joined some of them, or some of them joined us. I can't remember which. But we hadn't been going down this road toward the beach very long when we heard a wagon behind us coming down the road. We jumped behind the hedgerow, and the Germans
continue forward. And so they have much more ability to sustain combat in a hostile environment than most other people do, just by the unique nature of the experience that they've trained for.
As the first light of dawn hit the transports in the channel, the sound of more Allied bombers could be heard as the Americans took up where the British had left off. The aerial effort to smash the defenses shifted into high gear. And a new sound was added. From the sea, off the Normandy coast, came the thunder of the massed guns of the Allied warships.
On our way into Normandy Beach at the Augusta, the Texas, always fun. It looked like you could see the big shells going through the air, like they all different kind of colors. It was real like July the 4th. All different colors. It looked like a big suitcase. You could see that big shell going through the air.
Those big shells, 12, 14, 16-inch cells, as they would go through the air, would gather air behind them, and they would make a noise. It would sound like a train. They would go, chuk, 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 chuk. The air would come around, and it would make a sound so that on the ground under them, it would sound like an old steam engine was going over.
Our squadron had been selected to patrol the Omaha Beach at 5,000 feet. And when we first got there, we could see the battleships out there firing inland, and then we could see the explosions of where their shells went. And I was spending most of my time trying to figure out what the trajectory was, whether it was over us or under us. I didn't want to stagger into it.
In the German strong points, the men hunkered down and endured the barrage. When it lifted, they watched, awestruck, as thousands of ships and landing craft materialized out of the morning mist. The invasion had arrived. At about this time, Field Marshal Rommel finally received the reports of the night's fighting at his home in Germany. More importantly, General Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff, learned of von Rundstedt's order to move 2 panzer divisions forward. Furious, he countermanded the order. Jodl would not release the strategic reserves without Hitler's permission, and Hitler was still asleep with orders not to be disturbed. this was perhaps the most fateful decision the German High Command made on June 6th. It meant that the Mobile Reserve would not be able to intervene on D-Day. All this, of course, was far from clear to the soldiers on the transports getting their first look at France.
It was raining, pouring cats and dogs. The ocean was real rough. Everyone was getting sick, puking all over the place. All the GIs were sick. You have GIs crowding in one ship. You have, I don't know, about 3,000-4,000 guys. You wonder where they all come from, but they're all there on ship, almost shoulder to shoulder all the way. They loaded them up high and tight.
We were on these LSTs 24 hours more than we were supposed to be because the landing was delayed 24 hours by Eisenhower, as you know. And but that was a rather harrowing 24 hours because it was really rough weather, and everyone was on the LST was seasick before we even got to anywhere near the beaches.
Shortly before dawn, the soldiers of the assault divisions went over the side and climbed down cargo nets into their landing craft, pitching in the channel chop alongside the transports.
When we got into the small LCVPs, of course, it was much more occasion to make them seasick. So everybody, I think without reservation, was sick before they got into the beaches. But anyhow, about 12 miles offshore were loaded into the LCVPs that had been carried in the davits of the LST. And we went over the side, climbing on rope nets, ladders.
This net is heavy as lead. It's soaking wet. And they would drape this thing down over the side, and in my three-man crew, it would take 3 men just to haul this thing over the railing of the boat into the well of the boat. And at that point, they would have to stand in the rope and ride the rope while the boat went up and down beneath them to keep it taut. For you see, as soon as the troops start coming down that debarkation net to get into the boat, if they would stand on the deck of the boat and let it get slack between the boat.
6 miles from shore, the warships fired salvo after salvo at targets on the shore. Above the ships and the landing craft, waves of aircraft winged inland to attack German positions in the final assault before the men waded ashore.
D-Day, 7 o'clock in the morning, we went in after some gun emplacements. The weather was really bad. And we went in and fired at these guns, and I don't think we hit anything. I went back to England, and then they sent out another 8 aircraft, and they got them the second time.
I think it was Juno. And there's a building, they show this picture over and over again of pictures taken from a landing barge. And you can see this building straight ahead. Well, our target was a gun just to the east of that building. A built-in heavy emplacement, German emplacement. Unfortunately, we didn't get it quite knocked out, but it helped, So, nothing was guaranteed. But the sight from the air was just unbelievable because every old battleship all the Allies owned was out there banging away with their 15-inch rifles. And just a tremendous sight.
Above the firing warships came a parade of C-47s pulling gliders to the drop zones behind Utah Beach. Hundreds of Mustangs and Thunderbolts protected their flanks.
We had flight cover from fighter planes. And I remember seeing a couple of them come up alongside of our glider flight, and of course they're much faster than we are. And it felt pretty good to see those out there. I forget whether they're P-51s, I believe, but I think some were P-47s also. That off and on we'd see them all the way across the channel.
On
D-Day, we escorted airborne troops in, rendezvoused with the C-47 towing the big box glider. We could see the awesome sight of the D-Day invasion itself on the water. In fact, I told my guys, I said, if you get hit and go down, don't worry about it. You could walk back to England on the ships out there, and down every now and then you'd find a down C-47 or glider floating along. So it's just unbelievable sight, and we got to see it.
Despite being under almost constant aerial and naval bombardment, German anti-aircraft fire took a toll of the incoming gliders and transports. And even if they got through the flak without harm, many gliders crashed into the poles that Rommel had planted in the open fields or crash-landed on the rough ground.
I watched the gliders going in. I noticed that they were forced in many instances to land in fields where the Germans had put telephone-shaped poles every 10 feet, so they'd wiped out a lot of them on landing. But they went in.
We flew over the beaches at 900 feet at daylight, just breaking day. I'll never forget those 10 seconds that we flew over those beaches. Because I was standing behind the pilots, I wasn't belted in, and I was watching, well, just a few seconds going over the beaches, but I'll never forget it. I mean, I got more over few minutes over the beaches in our tow plane, which was a C-47. It was shot down, so we had to land, and we didn't land anywhere near where we were supposed to land. The area where we landed was hedgerow country, a little bit of plots. Our glider landed, crash landed, went into a bunch of trees. I fell out. 29 people were killed. I was the only survivor.
Those who did survive the landings moved out and reinforced the paratroopers. The good thing about the gliders was that those who survived the landings were concentrated and ready for combat. They also brought in badly needed heavy equipment like anti-tank guns and light artillery. These weapons would prove to be lifesavers in the hours to come as the paratroopers fought to hold their ground against heavy German counterattacks. Before the Americans landed at Utah and Omaha, the D-Day planners called for the elimination of several key German positions. Pointe du Hoc and the islands of Saint-Marcouf both were in a position to severely disrupt the planned landings on Utah and Omaha.
The landings at Utah Beach on D-Day were actually led off by landings of a cavalry unit on a small island, two small islands immediately off of Utah Beach called Saint-Marcouf, Ile Saint-Marcouf. Those two islands, one of which had a 19th century masonry fortification built by the French on it. Those two islands, it was known to Allied intelligence that they were being used by the Germans as, first of all, a communications center, as an early warning station, and then also as an observation point to control the fire of the various heavy seacoast artillery firing batteries in the region, the batteries at Asville, Kriesbeck, and then also Pointe du Hoc.
Even though it was a last-minute addition to the plan, the islands were thought to be a dangerous German strongpoint. Even a single German artillery spotter would greatly improve the accuracy of the German guns on shore.
Preparing for the Normandy invasion had taken almost 2 years, and they overlooked these two little islands that were off about 3,000 yards off of the coast of France. So they had to make sure that there weren't any Germans occupying the Azores, guns or anything. So B Troop of the 24th and A Troop of the 4th, 132 men were 3 weeks, they were trained to invade these islands and secure them before H hour. They were to attacked these islands at 4:30 in the morning. This was 2 hours before the main invasion. There weren't any Germans on these 2 islands. It was just a mass of mines, personnel mines.
The cavalry unit, the unit that landed there, suffered very high casualties on the mines and the booby traps that the Germans had left behind, but Ile Saint-Marcouf, the 2 islands were nevertheless captured.
At Pointe du Hoc, sitting atop a 100-foot tall cliff, stood a German bunker complex that housed heavy coastal guns capable of bombarding the ships off both Utah and Omaha Beach.
One of the many D-Day objectives was the artillery position at Pointe du Hoc. Now, the Germans had located on this one point of land an artillery battery with a forward observing position right out on the crest of the cliff. By positioning a gun battery here and positioning long-range heavy artillery here, the guns there were capable of delivering accurate fire to support any activity against any resistance against landing operations at Omaha Beach, or then by swinging back to the west, they could also deliver accurate gunfire to any invasion force that was arrayed off of Utah Beach area.
The battery had to be silenced, but to attack the battery with troops meant they would have to scale the cliffs. That was the mission assigned to the U.S. Army Rangers. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's mission got off to an inauspicious start when a combination of tidal conditions and navigation errors delayed the assault for 40 minutes. Once they did get ashore, the defenders greeted them with heavy fire. The first wave found themselves pinned down at the base of the cliff. 2 destroyers moved in to support the stranded Rangers, while a flight of medium bombers hit the cliffs from only a few thousand feet. Under the cover of these attacks, the Rangers began their daunting climb.
As they fought their way up, the Germans would from time to time hold an MP-47 machine gun over the edge of the cliff and spray machine gun fire down on them as they tried to climb. They would from time to time throw hand grenades off of the top of the cliff to the Rangers waiting down at the base of the cliff. And then using rope ladders, using hard ladder segments, they were able to climb all the way up.
Germans were up at the top, throwing grenades down and nasty things like that, and just generally shooting at us. And I didn't like the idea of trying to scramble up off of a grapnel or something because, well, it seemed like I'd be too exposed. And there was a little runnel just a bit off to the left where, water had run down and it left some of the ground had slumped and had fallen away, and it looked to me like there was a way I could scale it just by hand. So I did. I got to the top, and there's nobody there. Everybody's looking around over the edge, shooting and doing things like that. So I'm carrying a grease gun. So I'm up there shooting people in the back. There's nothing heroic about that. I'm not even proud of it.
A violent firefight erupted as the Rangers assaulted the emplacements. When the dust cleared, they discovered the coastal guns were nowhere to be found.
They then realized something that probably made them sick to their stomachs. They realized that the guns were gone. They had assaulted up this cliff into a position where there were no guns. Well, 2 of those Rangers, one of which was Lynn Lomel, and one other man moved inland from the area where the Pointe du Hoc battery had been located, and he actually found those guns located inland. They had been moved there, and those guns were positioned. They had ammunition nearby, and they were ready to fire, except that the German crews for those guns were a few hundred yards away eating their breakfast when Lynn Lomel stumbled onto the scene. And then Sergeant Lomel, with one other Ranger, used thermite grenades to disable the breech mechanisms, and they used the butts of their Thompson submachine guns to crack in the scopes, the aiming scopes and apparatus of these guns, and disable the guns, and then return back to Pointe du Hoc where the rest of the Rangers were fighting. So even though the Rangers assaulted up the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, when they got to the top of the cliffs, the guns weren't there. 2 Rangers operating independently found those guns inland and destroyed them, and so the firing battery at Pointe du Hoc was actually neutralized on D-Day.
With the mission completed, what was left of the 2nd Rangers dug in and waited to be relieved. Their attack drew a reaction from elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, the best German formation in the area. They counterattacked the Rangers late on D-Day, and it wasn't until 2 days after the landings that the Rangers were finally relieved. By then, over 60% of their force had been either killed or wounded. Off Utah Beach, the GIs of the 4th Infantry Division sweated out the final run to shore. Moments from seeing combat, the men were desperately seasick, tense, and anxious.
These 36 guys are standing there in the well of the boat, eyeing me eyeball to eyeball, not saying a word, they're not talking to each other, and it was really making me nervous, because now we are somewhat in a line abreast, poised to hit the beach shortly. And I'd have 4 or 5 boats to my right, 4 or 5 to the left. As I say, these fellows were kind of making me a bit nervous the way they were staring down. I didn't know what was going through their mind. And one of them piped up and finally said, "Look, Coxswain," he said, "we just landed Cistern and Solano a few months ago, and the Coxswain put us off in about 4 feet of water, and we telling you better not do that today." Oh, wait a minute, man, you're not going to get an argument out of me.
Utah Beach was physically separated from the other landing beaches by 2 rivers and over 8 miles of enemy-held ground. It had been added to the Overlord plan by Montgomery, primarily as a way to give the Americans a springboard to Cherbourg. A battalion of amphibious Sherman duplex drive tanks would be launched first and were timed to get to the beach about the same time as the first wave of 20 landing craft. 5 minutes later, the second wave of 32 more landing craft would come in. These carried more troops and engineers whose job it would be to clear lanes through the beach obstacles to allow the follow-on waves easier access to shore. 1,000 meters of open beach was protected by rows of mines along with anti-tank obstacles and so-called Belgian gates. The 5 possible exits from the beach were covered by German fortified strongpoints, each garrisoned by at least a platoon of troops. Waiting for the Americans were the men of the German 709th Static Division, which included several Ost battalions.
The Ost battalions were many of the defenses of the invasion beaches of D-Day. These were recruited largely, but not exclusively, from former Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the German army, especially in the great offensives 1941 and 42. And these people were basically given a chance of either dying, being worked to death in literal slave labor, or joining the German army. Many of these people were not ethnic Russians, but were from minority groups that did not have a particular love or allegiance to Stalinist.
I had grits, I had eggs, I had bacon, coffee, the whole 9 yards. And the worst part about it, I couldn't see where I was going. So I called on my trusty motor Mac to give me a little helping hand. And at that point, he reached out and got a bucket of seawater, which was cold that morning. And he dashed it in my face and hit me a second time when I told him, when he asked it, would I like another one? I said, "Oh, yeah, that was strong medicine." But when I said that, all these fellas bust out laughing. And it was the thing that it took in the heat of battle to relax the persons involved. And it caused them perhaps to think that, well, if the kid can take this, I guess he'll get us ashore safely.
Nearby destroyers and rocket-launching landing craft opened up with a final barrage, and P-47 fighter bombers thundered out of the overcast to bomb and rocket the German shore defenses. But the surviving German units were still able to lay down fire on the incoming landing craft.
You can see the bullets actually, the machine gun bullets actually hitting the water, and it's cascading in the water maybe 10 or 12 feet up in the air. And I can remember vividly going into the beach like this and seeing this water being sprayed out maybe like a block ahead of me, you know. And so
as I'm going in, your first reaction, if you got any common sense at all, is, put the boat in neutral. Okay, fella, let's hold up here for a minute and see what they're going to do. Maybe it's run out of ammunition, maybe it's change the position. You can't do that. And we're going in full throttle, which didn't mean very much, because with the boat loaded and with them having all that gear, maybe 80, 90 pounds of gear, we could only get up maybe about 13 knots. You can't stop. You can't go right. If you go right or left, we knew there were mines out there that the sweepers had not gotten to. So that would have been suicide to go think you're going to dodge that onslaught of the fire that you see laying out ahead of you. And they say you can't stop. For to do so, I would have caused a major gridlock all the way back to sea. So I don't know how we did it, but we just kept going. And of course, some didn't make it. Some of the boats were blown plumb out the water. But I guess I was one of the lucky ones. In fact, my 36 men and my crew did manage to get in without mishap.
The landing craft of the first wave ground ashore at exactly 6:30.
The landings at Utah Beach, they went wrong from the very beginning. First of all, as a result of the tidal situation, the landings were swept further to the south, away from the pre-designated landing area. But by landing farther to the south, they actually avoided heavy concentrations of German guns and also other German artillery.
The men poured out onto the beach and sprinted inland against light resistance.
The troops defending Utah Beach in our part were Austrian rather than German. And under the pre-invasion bombardment from the Navy and air, they had panicked and retreated. And therefore, when we landed where we did on Utah Beach, there was no small arms fire. It was under artillery fire then and for a couple of days until we pushed farther inland. But we did not endure the gun emplacements in concrete pillboxes and emplacements like in Omaha Beach.
The 4th had lucked out. The unusually strong current had served to throw the first wave ashore in the wrong place. When the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., splashed ashore, he discovered that they were a mile away from the planned assault beach.
As the first elements of that landing touched the beach, there on the beach, when they finally determined that they were further south than they were supposed to be, there was a very dramatic moment where the Assistant Division Commander for the 4th Infantry Division, General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., where he came ashore, he talked with some of his officers, they determined that they were further south than they should be, and they even entertained the idea of getting back on their landing craft, pulling out, and then moving to the north and landing again. And there was a famous moment where Roosevelt said, "No, we're not going to do that. We'll start the war right here."
After we got ashore, once we discovered we were about a mile and a half off course where we were supposed to land, Brigadier General, he said, "Let's go, man. We're going to, even though we're wrong, as far as the map is concerned, we're still going to go on ahead." So we got our wits together and we started forward.
15 minutes after the first wave landed, the Sherman duplex drive tanks showed up. Though late, they were a much-needed addition to the shallow beachhead.
DD tanks had the ability to move with tracks. They also had the ability to move with a pair of screws or propellers that could move them through the water. There were some DD tanks used at Utah Beach, but then at Utah Beach also, the landing environment did not have a bluff behind it. So early in the battle, LCTs, or landing craft tank, LCTs were able to move in and deposit non-DD Sherman tanks directly onto the beach. The vehicles that landed at Utah Beach, the specialized DD tanks, for example, but then also the non-specialized tanks, the half-tracks, the self-propelled guns, they were able to get on the beach during the day and begin moving inland. They didn't have to navigate over a bluff. They didn't have to have defiles in the bluff so that they could get inland. So the armored forces were able to make much more of a contribution at Utah Beach because they were capable of moving inland swiftly and then reaching and linking up with the airborne forces. And indeed, the armored forces were a significant element of the major battles that the divisions would continue fighting.
By 8 o'clock, 4 battalions were ashore. By 10, 2 more had been landed, and all were busy driving the Germans away from the landing area. Some of the 4th Division's units had managed to advance more than 6 miles before noon.
And we reached our objective. From there on in, we were waiting around for a short while for the members of the 101st and 82nd Airborne to advance forward. They were down around Carrollton and St. Mary Glees area at the time. And once we made contact with them, then we were able to go on ahead and continue toward Cherbourg.
Utah was actually, the beach operation itself was almost a secondary mission compared to the airborne landings the night before. There were 2 divisions of U.S. troops already operating in the area behind Utah Beach. So when the U.S. troops landed at Utah Beach, in fact, the German defenses were already on the verge of disintegrating. The Air Force had come in and bombed the German fortifications that were along Utah, and so they provided very little resistance when the U.S. forces arrived. The commander of the German forces at Utah Beach survived, and he has written accounts of his recollections. And basically, his unit, while not wiped out, was so badly weakened that it could offer very little resistance to the U.S. troops at Utah. But then another factor that contributed significantly to the successful landings at Utah Beach was the preliminary naval bombardment, where you had cruisers.
To see this going on around you and realizing that war is hell.
By dusk, the 4th Division had battalions from Les Forges on Highway 17 to the coastal village of Amel de Croute, and over 23,000 men and 1,700 vehicles had come ashore. They had fought hard and overcome rough seas, navigation problems, and German resistance. But the 4th Division was on European soil, and they were there to stay. Omaha Beach was backed by a bluff more than 100 feet high. It was covered by 15 German strongpoints and other extensive defenses. Additional positions on the top of the bluff or in the draws leading up to it could fire down on anyone coming ashore.
At Omaha Beach, approximately 24,000 Americans were landing against Germans behind concrete in prepared infantry fighting positions, Germans that were in casemates with field artillery, long-range artillery, short-range artillery, anti-motor torpedo boat guns. German infantry behind concreted infantry fighting positions with MG-42 and MG-34 machine guns, not to mention the supporting fire of pre-ranged and pre-sighted mortars. The Germans had a network of fires that they could focus in on the Omaha Beach invasion area that would be devastating. Omaha had far more pillboxes and other types of fortifications along the beach than at any of the American or British beaches. There were almost double the number of fortifications and gun sites than on any of the other beaches. And also, most of the Normandy beaches, the British beaches and Utah Beach, were manned by essentially second-rate German units, so-called static divisions. These were divisions that didn't have...
They did not work primarily because they floundered in heavy seas. I think there were a total of, out of the 32, there were maybe a total of 8 or 10 that finally got ashore somehow.
Shortly after 5:40, the naval force offshore opened fire on the defenses. However, poor visibility interfered with the aerial spotting for the guns, and combined with rough seas meant that most of the rounds overshot the German positions.
As far as you could see, there was battleships, there were destroyers, there was cruisers, there were all kinds of Navy gunfire, and they were hitting the beach, but they were not evidently not too effective.
Around 6 o'clock, almost 500 heavy bombers roared in over the coast and dropped 1,200 tons of bombs. However, the low cloud cover again interfered with visibility, and since the bombers had been cautioned not to hit the invasion fleet, they delayed their drop, causing most of the bombs to fall on the cow pastures and apple orchards inland of the beach defenses.
The Air Force, it was then called the Army Air Corps, missed the beach altogether. We had no support from the air on D-Day, none.
Some of the Army artillery, firing directly from landing craft, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach, trying to pick off targets on the bluffs.
We started on there, and they went, well, I didn't know it this at the time, but we went at 1,000 yards of the beach, and they fired 349 rounds of 105. Now, why they didn't fire 350, I don't know. Somebody counted them. And we went in and fired on selected targets till we couldn't fire them over within 1,000 yards of the beach. There wasn't nobody in front of us. Now, they did say that duplex tanks were supposed to be the first in. Didn't see nobody in front of us.
The seasick men in the landing craft heading into the beach were unaware of the failure of the naval and aerial bombardments and felt sure the German defenders had been killed by the preparation.
They depended on that preliminary aerial bombardment and also a preliminary naval bombardment to neutralize the German strong points and then also to provide craters that the infantry could use as cover as they advanced across the open beaches to the base of the bluff and then beyond.
Well, you had all these airplanes coming over, and then you had this fire from the ships, the shell in the beach. I tell you, there was so much stuff going on that, and so much noise from the guns, from the ships. We thought there would be none left, really, because that's what we were told, that the shelling and all that was going to take care of the Germans, and apparently they never killed nobody. They were sitting there waiting for us in these pillboxes.
So we thought we had it made because they told us what was going to take place. The Navy, the Air Corps, the tanks. So we thought we had it made.
Now, the infantrymen that were making the landings off of the Higgins boats that morning, they had been promised that when the ramps drop, you'll walk ashore. You're going to be facing a situation where the Germans are either dead in their bunkers or they're so stunned from the incredible weight of the preliminary aerial and naval bombardment, they won't be able to put up much in the way of resistance. Nothing could have been further from the truth.
Of course, got close to the shore, we could hear gunfire. We'd see there was a lot of haze or smoke over the beach. We, at that point, I guess, had figured out that maybe some of those measures had not been effective.
At 6:30, the first wave of landing craft came under German artillery fire.
When my little boat approached Bill Green's sector, the first thing that happened was the boat on our port side blew up. We were showered with wood, metal, and body parts from about 15 feet up.
A few minutes later, the first landing craft hit the beach at Omaha, and their crews dropped their ramps. Hardly a GI had taken a step forward when a hurricane of machine gun fire swept through their ranks.
It sounded like a chain being dragged across some metal. And then afterward, we realized it wasn't a chain, it was the machine gun bullets hitting the ramp. And when the ramp went down, then the guys in the front got hit, you know, and like I say, I don't know how any of us got out.
They dropped our ramp. It was a signal for every machine gun on that beach to open up on our exit to that boat. Lieutenant Harold Donaldson of Texas He was machine gunned right away, never got out of the boat. And a few of the people around him were machine gunned, like they showed in Saving Private Ryan. Now, the fellow in front of me was Clarius Riggs of Tennessee, and he was anxious to get off that boat to kill Germans. He was machine gunned on the ramp. I dove in behind him, and only my helmet was creased by a bullet. And there I was standing in bloody, neck-deep water, my rifle over my head.
A few of the landing craft crews, not wanting to expose themselves or their load of soldiers to the devastating fire, backed out into deeper water.
As we were going into the beach on this landing craft, the coxswain or whatever he was running the thing, he got up to the beach and he says, "I can't let the ramp down. I'm going to have to back out in deeper water. And you're going to have to go over the side." So he backed out into the water where it's about 8 feet deep, I guess, and we bailed out over the sides. But I got in on the beach and I knew that I didn't want to stay there. There was too many others laying around there.
Nowhere was it worse than at the Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach, in front of a little beach community called Vierville-sur-Mer. The elements of the 29th Infantry Division and the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions were to land there. The 29th Division, they landed with their first wave. It was A Company, 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division. When A Company landed, they had approximately 165 men. Within 5 minutes of combat, 91 killed in action. In addition to the 91 killed, they suffered about 65 wounded, so that literally in 5 minutes' time, an entire company of 165 men, a reinforced rifle company, had been reduced to a handful of men that were capable of fighting.
In essence, the invasion plan, as had been so meticulously formulated in the past 4 or 5 months, fell apart almost immediately. The immediate need for the American soldiers landing on Omaha Beach was survival.
As the first wave floundered, the second and third waves reached the beach, and the men staggered ashore amidst a shower of fire to join their fellow soldiers in a fight for survival.
The wave that I came in was largely decimated by fire, as had previous waves. And that particular area of the beach that I came into was one of the hottest, if not the hottest, on Omaha Beach.
Another loud thud behind me on the left, and that soldier was gone. I hit the sand behind one of the hedgehogs. Didn't offer much cover, but I hit the ground behind it, and I observed to my right, and Robert Dittmar of Fairfield, Connecticut, was lying on his back staring skyward, and he was yelling, I'm hit, Ma, Mother." Silent. I looked over to my left, and the noise was horrendous on that beach. Sergeant Clarence Robeson was staggering by me without his helmet, gaping hole in the left side of his forehead, his blonde hair streaked with blood, and I yelled for him to get down, but I'm sure he didn't hear me, and he was probably out of it. He staggered behind me, all the way behind me to the left, knelt down facing the wall, took out his rosary beads, and started praying. And that machine gunner in the zigzag trenches cut him in half. But I mean really cut him in half. We had 85% casualties in the first 5 minutes.
What made it so bad, the way they had it set up, their machine guns would crisscross to one another on the beach. So you were never without fire. And then they had the 88s coming in, German artillery, was firing in, and the mortars, and then you had the snipers, and it just never stopped, you know. I don't know how we ever got ashore, really.
And just then, an 88 millimeter shell went off in front of me and blew this cheek off. Took out my left upper jaw, the roof of my mouth. I had teeth and gums laying on my tongue. Bedford Holback got hit with the same shell that hit me here, and he died. And next to him was a fellow named Elmere Wright, who had a St. Louis Brown pitching contract, and he was lying dead. I crawled right by them.
You saw, unfortunately, people who were in agony dying and had not gotten any medical help yet. The medics were doing their best to get around, but they frankly were not able to do a lot, and they themselves were subject to this same enfilade fire. They weren't exempted from it.
The first landing waves took awful casualties. In the case of the 116th Regimental Combat Team, there were some companies that basically lost half their personnel within a half hour. Some units were simply entirely wiped out. It not only affected the infantry, though. One of the critical problems was that large numbers of the engineer teams that were supposed to blow gaps in the beach obstacles were also killed. These gap clearing teams were supposed to come in and blow up the obstacles so that as the ocean rose later in the day, they landed at low tide. It was later going to be high tide. The engineers were supposed to clear paths through these obstacles. Many of those engineer teams were killed. And as a result, later in the morning, there are no clear paths for the landing craft to come in to drop off reinforcements.
Before the few surviving engineers could accomplish their mission, the next wave arrived, and a new problem was encountered.
We got things hooked up, and then we couldn't fire to blow the gaps, and we were supposed to blow gaps in the obstacles. But then the infantry came in on top. They were either we were late or they were early. And it was a question of whether you was going to fire and blow the gaps and kill all your people, or let them take a chance and go on in and come back later and do it, you know.
After the first few waves, the Omaha landing was in utter chaos. Hundreds were already dead, and no real movement inland had been achieved. Omaha Beach was in jeopardy. By 9:30, the assault on Omaha Beach was a bloody shambles. The first assaulting waves were mixed together and lost cohesion as their leaders were killed. Seeing the carnage taking place on the beach, orders went out to change the plan. The LCIs, or Landing Craft Infantry, carrying the 115th Regimental Combat Team of the 29th Division, moved down the beach to land in a different area.
The 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division, who were going in first at a place called Veerville. We were trying to get up the Veerville draw, and we were waiting for them to succeed in gaining a foothold on that beach, or even a toehold. And they went in at 6:30 in the morning. We were due to go in at noon, but at 10 o'clock the order came down that we were moved up the coast about 2,000 meters and go in there.
We waited until the Navy commander, who was in charge of our flotilla, decided that putting us in where the 116th had landed was not feasible because everything was jammed up, and they only had two gaps blown by the Navy and the Army engineers. So we were shifted down to Easy Red in the 1st Division sector, and we landed with the 18th Regiment about the same time, which was probably 9:45, 10 o'clock in the morning.
As we were proceeding along the beach, we went about a mile or two out, 3 destroyers came alongside of us, U.S. destroyers, and accompanied us. And when we turned in right to go toward the beach, they turned right, and then about 300 meters from the beach, they turned right again. And as soon as they turned right again, they started firing all their weapons. And we landed almost dry. The skipper of the landing craft that I was on told us that if I can't get you in dry, I'm not taking you in. 1 foot in the water, went on land, little or no opposition. We got up the hill with almost no casualty. The sniper killed one of my men and wounded another, and that was it, as opposed to the carnage that was taking place at Veerville.
The 18th from the 1st Division and the 115th from the 29th were up on the top of the bluffs, largely intact and ready to go, and that's what expanded the beachhead as quickly as it did. I think those two regiments largely saved the beachhead.
Back at Vierville, the 116th was still pinned down by vicious German fire.
Most of the battle on our beach was a battle for survival. General Omar Bradley decided no more reinforcements. We were supposed to get the 115th Regiment of the 29th to reinforce us. He said no reinforcements to that beach. He landed them further down to the east, which was safer beaches. This is why we fought wounded. Either you gave up that beach or you kept fighting. So we decided to keep fighting. So we saw all our buddies dead.
Although the stunned survivors clinging to any cover they could find didn't realize it, the Germans on the bluffs had problems too.
The Germans began having pauses in their firepower. Early on, with the first waves landing, they were able to devastate those first waves with machine gun fire, very accurate and powerful machine gun fire. But then they would get the barrels too hot and they'd have to wait for a barrel to cool down, or they would exhaust their ready supply of ammunition, which would program a little bit of a pause into the action.
I decided it was time to get off the beach. So I crawled to the wall with all this machine gun fire going around on the sand around me, but they didn't hit me.
And one thing we were lucky, it had like a little cliff, I guess you'd call it. It was a rise in the land, so it was about maybe 5-6 feet high. So when you got to that, if you guys could get close enough to it, then they couldn't hit you with the sniper fire or the machine gun fire.
I could see that there was indeed a pretty good rise of ground to give protection. When I worked my way up to that point, I thought I had it made. Of course, a lot of other people felt the same way, and this became a problem in that the soldiers tended to collect there and not want to go any further.
General Coda walked up and down the beach with rarely taking cover from German fire, urging the men to move forward, urging the men to take action, because he knew that it was a death sentence if they stayed still lying prone behind the low sea walls and rock embankments that mark the high tide line of the beach. The Germans were so good and trained so effectively in these coastal defenses that they were very well prepared to drop in mortar rounds and artillery rounds among the mass of men who were lying, seeking cover behind these low sea walls. And Coda walked up and down the beach saying, "Move, move or you're going to die."
He just really was an inspiration for everybody, because he was fearless, and he just said, hey, you guys, let's don't die here. Let's do something. If we're going to die, let's get off the beach, and maybe we'll survive that way. But there's no way we can survive here.
The Navy offshore did what it could to help the soldiers on the beach. Ships moved in closer and pounded the German positions with point-blank fire.
Naval gunfire was, when it was finally able to be directed by trained observers, it was very effective, and it really, in the final analysis, was one of the things that saved the day. That was the properly directed gunfire, particularly from cruisers and primarily destroyers that came in close enough to be able to make their fire effective.
Like this one battleship, I'm not sure which one it was, but it was so close to the shore, firing into the pillboxes and what have you. You'd think the flame from the guns were going to scorch you. That's how close they were. I don't know how they didn't run aground, really.
Finally, exit E1 was opened up by a combination of good shooting and determination.
The reinforced concrete pillbox at exit E1, which had an 88 millimeter gun in it that was enfilade sighted down the beach. It was put out of action by a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun that managed to lay around in the aperture which struck the steel shield in front of the gun behind that aperture, perforated it and exploded, and it killed the gunner that was in there. The engineer troops came forward with their Bangalore torpedoes to breach the barbed wire entanglements and with other explosives to breach the reinforced concrete and steel fortifications that had been placed across the exits. And that resulted in our being able to clear exit E1 first. And it was an important exit.
Still, the success of the landing remained in doubt as the following waves struggled in against fierce German resistance. Should future waves be postponed? Should they give up on Omaha and withdraw? A decision had to be made.
This discussion, and it was a high level, the highest level, let's say, that was present on the beach, must have lasted for maybe a half hour, during which time they were almost in constant contact with General Bradley by radio. And the long and the short of that was that they made the decision not to withdraw from Omaha Beach, but to rather to hold up the landings for a few hours at least.
The extra time made the difference as the infantry moved up and attacked German positions one by one.
I noticed these fellows beckoning me to come up to where they were, and there was a German pillbox right there on the beach, back in the bank. And I approached them, and they said, "Shoot at those slits in that pillbox with your rifle," because we wanted to slip around behind and capture the Germans that was in there. And so I followed instructions, and they captured the pillbox, and so then I went with them, and we went up to our left and up a bank and up over the bank in behind this little town. I didn't know where I belonged or anything. And I got out into some orchards, and a fellow beckoned me to come over to where he was, and he was shooting a 60 millimeter mortar, but he didn't know where any of the other company was, but he had some Germans for targets, and he was working on them.
In the end, the draws were opened up slowly and for the most part through small level action of squads or platoons of men with hand grenades, rifles, Browning automatic rifles, satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes. But it was a laborious and terribly costly process by which men had to frontally assault through these very meticulously prepared defenses and basically get right at the Germans toe-to-toe.
By mid-afternoon, the efforts of handfuls of brave men were beginning to tell.
12 of us, all wounded, decided to go up the bluff. And they were fighting fiercely against us, and our ranks were becoming depleted. By the time we finished knocking out that machine gun, there were only 7 of us left. Now, not all due to German fire. Some of them were just that seriously wounded that they died.
And it's something like a crack in a dam. It starts off as something very, very small and very trivial. These early breakthroughs or these early incursions that the U.S. infantry made were very, very small scale. They were 10 here, 20 there, that sort of thing. Nothing very dramatic. But through the course of the day, this started happening more and more, and the tens became hundreds. And by about midday, the U.S. Army had the better part of several hundred men up above the bluffs, and during the course of moving up the bluffs had knocked out a fair number of the German defenses. So that by the afternoon, when the reinforcements do start to arrive, there's some significant penetrations of the German defenses. And at that stage, the German defenses start to crumble.
As German positions began to fall and the deadly fires slackened, the landing on Omaha could resume.
That afternoon, the boats were still coming in, the army was coming in. They kept pouring men on the beach then. They just kept a steady flow. One boat would come in and pull out, another one take its place, and kept unloading infantry,
Late afternoon I went in. The carnage on the beach, the tanks, the smell, I'll never get rid of that. Burning flesh, see a tank running over, guys laying there wounded in the tank, can't see them, just rolls over them. You see a pair of legs standing in the stand, but from the waist up there's nothing there. Or you see an arm laying over here and a leg over there. And the bodies floating out in the water, bobbing up with the tide. You almost had to push them aside to get in because they hadn't been recovered yet.
The British plan called for the naval bombardment to last almost a half hour longer than at the American beaches. This was to be coupled with aerial bombardment from both British and American bombers, which would concentrate on the German coastal batteries and strongpoints. Also, the transports carrying the British assault units would anchor closer in than those in the American area, reducing the time spent in the landing craft. The British plan also included extensive use of Hobart's funnies, specially designed armored vehicles, to help reduce obstacles and enemy positions. Finally, the British would land an hour later than the Americans, at 7:30, when the tide was farther in.
That Canadian 3rd Infantry Division landing at Juno Beach, and also the British
of reforming.
This is the 21st Panzer Division in name only. This is not the unit that fought in North Africa. It's just a few of the personnel that came back from North Africa are in this unit, but it is a unit in the process of forming in France. They have some captured French equipment because, frankly, there's just not enough German equipment available at the time to form the unit. They have some real issues. It's a unit that is not combat ready, not rated as combat ready for the Eastern Front. However, having said all that, it is still the most potent and most mobile German force within range of the beaches. It's the only counterattack force available on D-Day.
But before dealing with the 21st Panzer Division, the British and Canadians had to fight through the tough beach defenses. The longer naval and aerial bombardment in the British area was quite effective at reducing the initial German resistance to the landing. However, nature played havoc with the assault waves. High seas and currents caused major problems at Gold and Juno. Units became mixed up and landed at the wrong locations. Some landings were delayed, and the amphibious Sherman duplex drive tanks had to be landed directly onto the beaches in many places. Some of the first vehicles ashore were flail tanks that moved up the beach and cleared lanes through minefields and barbed wire. Then around 7:30, the landing craft hit the beach, and the British soldiers began swarming ashore.
Depending on where they came ashore on Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division troops met varying degrees of resistance. Over on their right, they ran into that same 352nd Infantry Division, the tough German troops that gave the Americans so much grief on Omaha Beach. But on the left and in the center, they had a German static division that could not provide anywhere near the same kind of resistance. As a result, they pushed through the beach defenses and were successfully assured.
The 21st Panzer Division doesn't really get its act together until about 10:30 in the morning. When that order comes down for them to counterattack, it's against the beaches where the British are landing in the vicinity of Caen. That attack itself, because of what is going on in the area and the British moving inland and everything, that counterattack really doesn't get going till 1600 or about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. But the counterattack is successful in some areas in that a Kampf group, a small organization of German infantry and Mark IV tanks, actually penetrates all the way to the coast between the British landings. So the division has kind of a spotty record on D-Day. One thing is for certain, however, that
so that we assisted them in that thinking by the fact that we sent General Patton down there at Dover to set up, as it turned out, a fictitious assemblage of troops to create the illusion that we were definitely coming in there. And of course, the reason being that I guess the hierarchy realized that General Patton had an ego of such that he would never go down in history as one who sat on the sidelines and watched all this take place. So they bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Hitler continued to believe that Normandy was a feint and that the real invasion would fall at the Pas de Calais.
There are many reasons that the D-Day invasion succeeded. One of them, and a very important one, was that the Germans failed to commit decisively what forces they had to counterattack. Part of the reason that happened was they were still fascinated at the possibility the Allies were really coming ashore at Pas de Calais and Normandy was nothing but a diversion. To keep that illusion alive, Allied radio broadcasts on the day of the invasion made a point of saying, this is the first of many operations to come. The Germans were frozen at the switch, could not commit, and by the time they figured out what was going on, it was too late.
Back in England, the ultra-intercept officials were waiting for the Germans to initiate Case 3. That was the German code word to commit all reserves against the Allied landing in the area. And the real concern by the Allies at this point is that the 15th Army, a very powerful German formation, is only a day's march away from the Normandy area. However, this signal is never sent because the Germans are convinced that Normandy is just a diversion and the real invasion will come in the Pas de Calais area, which is where the 15th Army is defended.
It was a bad day.
It's hard to say what I felt like. As I said before, I was so scared. I was so scared.
It was a fantastic achievement, but it had its drawbacks. If D-Day had failed, who knows what the world would be like today.
When I came home on leave, they put up our names in the paper. There's 3 of us from this area. And they had our names, and then one of them got killed. When his daddy was getting off of work, he stopped by the house. And they had sent him a note, a telegram, saying that his son had been killed, but they hadn't found the body. And he wanted me to tell him that he was a prisoner or whatever, that he, you know, and this man, and I mean, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, that was my only son. That kind of shook me up. And later on in life, I'd look at my sons and just hope they didn't have to go through something like that.
Entering the war, American military planners faced a mammoth problem: how to take the fight to the aggressors who were protected by vast stretches of ocean. The answer hit upon was to develop landing craft and tactics to establish amphibious warfare as a viable strategy. America's last amphibious landings in combat had been before the turn of the century in the Spanish-American War and at Veracruz, Mexico in 1916. Much had to be learned and equipment developed before Allied plans could be fully realized. Yet by the end of the Second World War, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, would state, "The outstanding development of this war was the perfection of amphibious operations, the most difficult of all operations in modern warfare." On the 7th of August 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal in the first American amphibious operation of the war. The landing craft that brought them ashore were early Higgins boats, a civilian design which had been adapted for military use. The operation showed several weaknesses in equipment and doctrine. While the Marines adopted new methods, the original Higgins boat design was further modified by removing the bow machine gun positions and making the bow into a ramp. This new design allowed the troops to exit the landing craft quickly without exposing themselves more than necessary. Thus, the LCVP was born. Arguably the most reliable and versatile landing craft of the war, the LCVP was 36 feet long and just over 10 feet wide, its shallow draft allowing it to operate in as little as 18 inches of water. The crew of 3 was able to transport 36 combat-loaded troops, a 3-ton vehicle, or over 4 tons of cargo in their rugged little craft.
When you say 36 persons, and you look about and look at, well, there's plenty of room, except for one thing. Every one of these men are wearing on their back about an 80 or 90 pound pack with everything they own in that knapsack. And time you put this gear on, now each man is occupying 2 spots. So now when I tell you there were 36 people in here, they packed in here like sardines. Now once those fellows are out of the boat and they moving on ahead, they may go out there 15 or 20 feet or whatever, and the next thing you know, they got water up to their chin. And in some instances, some of these fellows actually stepped off like this and disappeared. Because you see, for months on end before we ever arrived there, we were bombing that area, critically, and I'm sure there were probably some craters down there, maybe 20 or 30 feet deep.
As General Eisenhower said in his 1944 Thanksgiving Day address to the nation, "Let us thank God for Higgins Industries, management and labor, which has given us the landing boats with which to conduct our campaign." He was later quoted as saying, "If Higgins had not designed and built these, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." As versatile as it was, the LCVP was simply not big enough to do the job alone. After the first wave was in and the landing progressed, there was a need for men to be rapidly placed ashore. So the Landing Craft Infantry, or LCI, was created. Although there were many variations, the role of the LCI was to land 200 soldiers by way of 2 ramps in the bow as rapidly as possible. 158 feet long, a bit over 23 feet wide, and flat-bottomed, the LCI wasn't designed for ocean voyages, but the necessities of the war caused them to be pressed into service. A crew of at least 24 worked within the quarter-inch steel hull, and using 8 6-cylinder GM engines, they transported men and supplies throughout the world during the latter part of the war. The last problem confronting planners was how to get large items of equipment and supplies to sustain and expand the bridgeheads ashore. American engineers responded by designing the LST, Landing Ship Tank, or Large Slow Targets, as their crews nicknamed them. The LST was 328 feet long with a 50-foot beam and was capable of carrying 2,100 tons over long distances. The bow consisted of clamshell doors, which allowed vehicles and equipment to roll on or off the ship rapidly. Also fitted with an internal ramp, equipment could be stored on the deck as well as in the hold. The LST's ability to move close to shore ensured the Allied ability to sustain landings over the beach and made it the workhorse of the amphibious campaigns.
We would usually come in the fourth or fifth wave, would have an LST coming in with ammunition or heavy equipment. When they were successful in landing depended on the skipper of the ship. A couple of the landings that I went on, the skipper was pretty good because he had been on a number of them before, and he would blow the water out of the front ballast tanks, and he would fill up the back ballast tanks, and then the boat would rise up in the front, and he was able to go right up onto dry land. With a lot of the other skippers, they didn't want to take the chance of landing high and dry and then wouldn't be able to get off. But the skippers that I had, he would throw out the back anchors way out back of the ship, and then after we unloaded, he was able to pull his ship off. And it took about 8 or 10 LSTs to haul the whole regiment.
The necessity of crossing large bodies of water to contest an enemy-held shore inspired American amphibious doctrine. American engineers and workers ensured that the landing craft to perform the job were available, and the valiant crews of these essential craft landed American ground forces where they were needed. Together, it was an unbeatable team.